Let's talk about the hip hinge, how to do it, how learning to do it can improve your athleticism and can also help you resolve chronic injuries. So first off, you gotta pull your pants up. Get your waistband to your belly button and the valley of your low back. Pulling your pants up this high gives you sensory feedback that will help you hinge. See, if I had my waistband pulled down to my tailbone, it wouldn't give me the same sensory feedback, and if anything, it might interfere with my ability to bend cleanly at the hips. And that's essentially what the hip hinge is, combined with some other factors that we'll go over, but you see how I'm bending mainly at my hips? Imagine there's a gear right here, and I'm turning that gear to bend over. And then once I get to a position where okay, that gear is not going to turn anymore, then that's my cue to come back up. And so for you, if you have a lot of flexibility, and if your stance promotes it, you might get even deeper than that. Or you may be more shallow. Everyone's stopping point currently will be a little different. So don't try to go to the same depth as someone else. Simply focus on that gear. Turn it as far as you can. And once you get to the point where it's not turning anymore, then that is your end point. And then you come back up from there. Now, some common mistakes. Locking out the knees as you bend over. And locking out the knees too early as you stand up. See, if you're having this issue, then what you can do is focus on keeping your knee right over your midfoot the entire time. See that? You see how in a proper hip hinge, it's like my body is hinging over my knee. My hips are, right, they're turning. And my knee just stays in one spot the whole time as I descend and as I come back up. And the way that you can tell that you're fixing this mistake is you can feel more glute tension. See, if you slam your knees back like this, you're probably getting a lot of hamstring and back of the knee tension more than anything else. So if you can feel your glutes more than you can feel your hamstrings as you bend over, then you're on the right track. It's not that you shouldn't feel any hamstrings, it's that you should feel your glutes more than your hamstrings. So that's the first mistake. Now the second mistake is shortening your spine as you bend over, right? Whether it's you're shortening in the front of your spine like this, or you're shortening in the back of your spine like this. You don't want to do either of those on the way down as well as on the way up. You want to keep a long spine. So think of the top of your head and your butthole. They are at opposite ends of your spine. So if you want to keep a long spine, then you want to get those two places on your body to stay as far away from each other as possible. So in your starting position, place your attention on the top of your head and your butthole and try to get long between those 2 points. And then as you bend over, continue to try to keep the distance between those 2 points long, you see? And however your spine looks will be however your spine looks. Just try to keep the top of your head and your butthole as far apart from each other the entire time. From the start, as well as you are bending over, as well as you are standing up again. And if you get all this right, then what you should feel is your glutes in charge. Think of a bicep curl, how as you're lowering the weight in a bicep curl, your biceps, they're lengthening, but there's still tension in them. And that tension is what controls the descent of your forearm. And so it's the same thing here with your glutes. Your glutes are to control the descent of your torso. Does that make sense? So the analogy here is biceps, forearm, glutes, torso. And if you're feeling any hip pinching in the front, or even after accounting for all these common mistakes, you still can't feel your glutes very well, then what you can do is play with your stance. You may find that widening your stance can help you get that hinge going better. So play with your exact stance width, but keep all the other factors constant. Notice how my knee is still staying over my midfoot, and I'm still keeping my spine long, and I'm still bending over mainly from the hips and stopping once that has run out. Now, how can this improve your athleticism? Think of your hips as the prime movers of your body. So let's say you are trying to throw a ball with your left hand. Notice how to do that in the most effective way, you gotta load up that hip. So I'm loading up my left hip, and then I'm straightening that hip. Do you see how that is the same thing that's going on with a hip hinge for my left hip? See that? I'm loading my left hip, and then I'm straightening my hip. It's the same thing. So the better that you get at this, the more that you'll be able to access your hips in those sort of athletic motions, whether it's throwing, or it's squatting, or it's sprinting. The better that you can load your hips, the more athletic that you will be. It's that simple. Now, how does this help resolve recurring injuries? Well, let's say in your deadlift, you don't have access to a hip hinge, and instead you rely on your low back for the bending and the straightening. Now, this is not inherently wrong. I mean, if you really want to just work your low back, then this would arguably be the best way to do it. But if you're limited to this way of bending over, and you always feel low back strain, no matter how many times you've lowered the weight and then gradually built up again, then I'd argue the sensible thing to do is to learn how to better access the hip hinge so that you can shift work off of your low back and put it more into the hips. And that way, it'll be easier for you to avoid the same recurring low back injury because your hips will have learned to take back that work. And you can apply this to all of the surrounding structures. Let's say you are running, and every time you land, you don't know how to load your hips. Well, that force has to go somewhere. Maybe it will go more into the knees. And it's not that loading the knees is wrong, but if the knees keep taking on the load that your hips are supposed to take, well then they're gonna more easily get overstressed and then injured. So by learning to access loading your hips, you can take stress off of your knees and put it more into the hips. And those are just some examples of how learning to better hip hinge will help resolve recurring injuries. Of course, there's many other factors to injuries, but this is a very big one that you want to make sure you have checked off. So that is how to hip hinge, and how learning to hip hinge can help you improve your athleticism as well as resolve recurring injuries. If you've got any questions, let me know.